So today you're reading an excerpt from your historical romance, Never Cross a Highlander. And just for readers who haven't heard of it yet, I'm going to read the blurb. And I did Google how to pronounce some of these names. I hope I get it right.
Okay.
AILSA Connery has waited 3 long years to finally escape her enslavement at Stirling Castle and reunite with her clan. But all her carefully laid plans are completely destroyed by the arrival of the fierce Highland warrior known as Dubh Mahoun, the Black Devil, who has plans of his own. KALLUM MACNEILL's fearsome reputation has long allowed him to keep hidden his secret double life of freeing enslaved captives across the land. Only it works against him when he inadvertently kidnaps a servant lass he assumed had gone astray from the group he had come to free. When he discovers she has plans to head in the opposite direction, he can't leave her to travel alone or risk her exposing his true identity. Escorting a lone woman should be easy, if only the beauty didn't oppose him at every turn. As they make their way to the Highlands, one feisty hellion fighting the strong, prideful devil, their heated sparring leads to heat of a totally different kind. But the perils KALLUM must face to get AILSA home safely and untouched are nowhere as near as dangerous as what lies in wait for them. Such a great Scottish setup. Lisa, take it away.
All right. So the scene I'm going to read is when they're on their way back to the Highlands. And I'll set it up just a little bit because it's the start of chapter 14, but they've just had a run-in with bad guys and basically three bad guys, and he took care of that. But he does have a wound. He's been cut and she wants to look at it. And he's, of course, the big bad man. He's like, no, I'm fine. We have to get on the road. And they only have one horse. So he's put her on the horse, ignoring her. And she's a healer, ignoring her attempts to get him to let her at least look at it, wrap it, do something so it doesn't get infected. And he refuses to help her down. And as he's getting up, she shoves him off so that he can't get up on the horse. Now he catches his balance and he doesn't fall, but in the process, he's a little upset. He still refuses to help her down. So she basically swings her leg over and starts to come off this really big horse. And of course, he catches her and helps her. So now he's really annoyed because he feels like she's manipulated him. And this is where we pick up. And this is kind of what's been going on with them the entire time they've been on the road. But we get a little shift in this scene. So,
Exciting.
chapter 14. Elsa looked away from the angry annoyance on the MacNeill's face. She'd gotten the upper hand in this matter, primarily because she knew his sense of honor would not allow him to let her fall when dismounting the horse. That sense of honor did not mean he was not upset with her. Mayhap it made him more so. She sensed he hated that she had figured out how to use his personal code against him. All truth, she was surprised by how much she enjoyed vexing him. Something about this man brought out the contrariness in her. The tension between them as he tried to control her, and she fought not to be controlled, evoked some of the headiest emotions she had ever felt. Not that she had never faced off against a dominant male, but something about CALLUM MACNEILL was different. Something about the way she felt around him was different. She spread the cut in his tunic wide enough to glance inside at the wound. The slash across his skin was long, but did not appear deep from this angle. To be sure, she needed a closer look. Remove your tunic for me. She glanced up into his eyes, and the intensity that met hers sent an unfamiliar frolic of emotions through her. He eyed her without movement, but 'twas not merely obstinance that held him immobile. Her request, though innocent, suggested other possibilities. Ignoring the charged moment, Elsa directed him to focus on the task at hand. I need a closer look, MacNeill. The wound looks not deep enough to need stitching, but to be certain, I must view it without your garment in place. The MacNeill understood her request for what it was. His piercing sable eyes, nonetheless, displayed an awareness of the more forward implications of her request. After the briefest hesitation, his voice rasped with an edge born aught other than annoyance. We do not have time for this. Her healer's mien of authority took over, and her hands went to her hips. Then stop wasting daylight and do what I ask. His eyes tracked the placement of her hands, and something flickered in their dark depths before he pulled off his tunic with a barely visible grimace she was meant not to see. She decided not to mention the grimace and ignore what looked suspiciously like amusement at her expense. Instead, she touched her hand lightly to his side. His abdomen flinched inward at her touch, but he made no sound. Aye, 'tis not deep, but I would clean and wrap it afore we ride on. She glanced at his face again. All irritation had left his gaze and been replaced by something more visceral. He glanced at her hand, which still rested on his side, and swallowed noticeably. A new tension arose, something that had very little to do with vexation. And there it was again, that shiver of emotion that left her unbalanced and vulnerably raw in a manner she'd never experienced in all her seasons of life. Through all the conflict and verbal sparring and hostility that pinged between them, simmered a temptation, a heated draw that made everything female in her want to surface and be bold. Her gaze remained imprisoned by his, and without conscious thought, her fingers traced down the path of grooves, outlining his defined abdomen. The feel was totally different from the bony angles and soft middle of the runt who had groped her earlier. The plains of Callum's skin were ridged with several raised scars, a testament to his many battles. 'Twas enticing to be this close to such strength she had counted on with unfailing confidence to untangle her assailant from her afore he did more than grope at her breast. She had survived such groping before, on more than one occasion. 'Twas nothing she had not prepared herself to endure whilst living as a captive, and 'twas nothing she could not handle, though the callous treatment never ceased to anger her. When her hand reached the trio of muscles that made a horizontal line beneath the MacNeill's navel, she looked down to watch her hand as it slid across the ridged path and paused to trace a pucker that suggested he'd been stabbed in the stomach some time past. His abdomen went concave as he hissed in a breath and caught her hand. Anne. Her eyes flicked to his. He had called her that earlier. It had hit her odd to hear him call her by her name for the first time and use the wrong one. The mistake made sense to her, for that was what he had heard her called by the king. It had never occurred to her that he knew not her real name. "'Tis not my name," her voice near purred with a breathiness she'd never heard from herself. His hand tightened minutely around her as the seductive tone of her revelation, and then his head tilted in confusion. "'Tis what they decided to call me after my capture. My given name, my true name, is AILSA." He reached up with his other hand and pushed his fingers into the base of her loose braid, messy and barely still plaited after all she had been through in the past days. "I make sense." Her eyes questioned his meaning. "And did not suit you." With a gentle tug, he pulled her closer. "Ailsa, 'tis a strong name, one more fitting a brave Highland lass such as yourself." Warmth spread through her, and she stared at him in amazement. He thought her brave. The longing, the reverence in his eyes made her feel desired and significant in a way she'd never known. They stood so close the heat of his skin seeped through her, and his intent to kiss her showed clearly on his face. Oh, how she wanted his kiss. He thought her brave. She near trembled at the thrill that a warrior such as he thought her worthy of his admiration, not just his lust. This morn had come with challenges she could ill imagine facing or surviving on this trek without the MacNeill at her side. The urge to lean into his strength and allow him to replace every bad kiss she'd ever received with one that would make her feel like a woman and not like a possession near overwhelmed her. 'Twere not proper, these feelings, nor was this the right timing or place for them to give in to this pull she had felt between them from the moment she laid eyes on him. They needed to be mindful of their surroundings and leave this place as soon as possible. So when his head eased lower, she broke eye contact and looked down to avoid a meeting of lips she was unsure she could survive unscathed. Her forehead landed temporarily against his bare chest, and her breath stuttered uneasily from her lungs. Callum's hand disengaged from the hair at her nape, brushed lightly over her head, then dropped gently to her back. He drew small circles against the fabric of her dress in a reassuring caress and waited in silence while she gathered herself. Her hand quivered against his warm, scar-adorned skin in a breath or 10. Then she fisted her hand at her side and pulled away, happy that her head had blocked his view of the prior trembling of her fingers. "I need to attend your wound," she finally said. "I?" No censure or annoyance entered his tone. Surprised, she looked up. She had expected him to be upset with her avoidance of his advance. She had been the one, this time, to slip them over the edge of propriety. His lips forged a wry tilt at one side, but his eyes stayed fervent and consuming. "You may want to keep your hands from wandering past the area of the wound, then," he said, his deep voice laced with dark innuendo. She dipped her head, fighting back a blush she could feel rising. "I'll need to clean the wound, then wrap it. 'Twill not take long." She grabbed his water skin from the horse, cleaned the wound, then ripped a few strips from the torn dress she changed out of to wrap around his midsection. Once that was done, he replaced his sliced tunic, put her back on the mare, and mounted behind her. They rode without speaking. Their almost kiss left a quiet tension between them that lent nervous anticipation to Ailsa's journey. He wanted to kiss her. He would kiss her one day. 'Twas not a matter of if, more like a matter of when. And the more she thought about that impending kiss, the more she struggled between the lure of a maiden's burgeoning desires and the urge to run and hide. She unknowingly awakened a sultry beast, and she knew not how to handle such an animal. Hold her own in a battle of wits? Aye. Fell a rabbit with a shot from a bow? Aye. Well, once she was back in practice. But illicit encounters between a man and a woman? She had no skill at that. She had no experience with consensual carnality between a male and a female, and propriety mandated that, as an unmarried lass, she should not think on such unseemly affairs. Marriage factored not into her plans. Accordingly, the social rules that applied to her intended station in life dictated she stay a chaste, single woman or enter an abbey or some such. She certainly had no intention of entering an abbey. She had hard enough time embracing the teachings of a church that ignored, even justified, the enslavement of an entire people. No need to be such a hypocrite. Did that mean she would never know the passion between a man and a woman? Many females decried the act as painful and not worth the trouble. Those who believed in love matches oft told a different tale. She knew not which ones to believe. And if she indulged, whether the experience be pleasing or horrid, would that make her not but a whore? Her mother had told her much about what went where and why when a man sought his pleasure, but she never mentioned repeated pain or unappealing couplings. Ailsa got the sense that her mother's memories of times with Ailsa Shire were anything but unpleasant. In fact, those very memorable liaisons caused many to label her mother a whore. 'Twas not what Ailsa had thought or believed of her mother. 'Twas not a designation her mother had accepted or allowed to shame her or make her cower from public life. If Ailsa were to live her life on her own terms, as her mother had, she must be prepared to leave off the opinions of others might have of her, in which case, if she were to consider testing the boundaries of mating, 'twas mayhap best to engage in such matters of the flesh with a man she did not find amiable, a man like the MacNeill, so that amorous emotions were not at risk. Liar! Her brain called foul on her classification of her feelings for the MacNeills as uncongenial, but she shut it down. Whatever feelings of enmity she thought she lacked for the warrior, she could not deny he was easily the most virile man she'd ever met. Tall, broad, strong, and foul-tempered, she thought. She glanced over her shoulder to check his expression. He stared back at her. That sliced brow peaked in curiosity, lips tilted at one edge in arrogant tease. Except when he wasn't. And when he wasn't, he was devastating to her senses. That lazy smirk sent a tingle through her, and that feel of his muscled arms surrounding her as they rode made her feel not only safe, but heated from her center down through the tips of her toes. She was not so simple as to believe that the act of loving equated to the emotion love. She need not succumb to the latter to indulge in the first. The question was whether she wanted to indulge in the first, and if she did, was the MacNeill the man with whom she dared indulge? The dilemma perplexed her through most of their ride, for the day until she finally dozed off in his arms. Callum nudged Elsa to wake her a bit later. She snuggled deep into his arms, not wanting to be roused. She made a contented sound and rubbed the side of her face against his beard. He went immobile at the nuzzle, shock and desire coursing through him. While he held himself taut, she did it again, bunting against him like a contented feline. Visions flooded him of what it might be like to have her nuzzle against him this way when they were both fully nude and stretched out on a bed, skin to skin. His hold on her tightened. 'Twas his tightening embrace that finally made her eyes flutter open. She looked up at him. Her cheek still rested against him in such a way that her skin brushed the edge of his chin when her head moved. She hummed lightly, seemingly enjoying the feel of his facial hair against her soft skin. Her lips lifted, and then she was the one to go immobile. The reality of what she had done flitted across her face, along with the wash of embarrassment. The embarrassment did not last. The look in her eyes shifted, and a pulsing curiosity took its place. He'd seen the same curiosity in her expression when she traced the scars on his stomach this morning. Daringly, she lifted her hand and rubbed her palm against the opposite side of his face. He did not move, waiting to see what she would do next. Her hand traced his beard to the base of his ear and slowly came back the other way to feel the hair along his chin and upper lip. Her fingers brushed his lips in the process, and for a brief instant, she left her fingers against his closed mouth with a pensive expression on her face. He suppressed the craving to touch his tongue to her fingertips, not wanting to startle her so much that she'd stop her tactile exploration. Finally, she dropped her hand to the edge of his mouth and pressed his face close to hers while she rubbed her cheek deliberately and with quiet relish against the other side of his beard. When she dropped her hand, she looked directly into his eyes unrepentantly. Why? He cleared his throat to alleviate the noticeable strain in his voice, but the gruffness lingered. Why did you do that? She held his gaze and admitted, I was curious. A blush lit her skin before she added, I've been wondering what that would feel like, and I wasn't sure I'd get another chance to find out.